Have you ever seen a family feud so explosive that even the walls inside the palace seem to hold their breath? Because that's exactly what happened the moment insiders claim Prince William uttered a line so cold, so final, that every person who heard it knew the royal family had crossed a point of no return. Imagine this: the future King of England, a man trained his entire life to stay composed, polished, and diplomatic, finally losing control, finally snapping, finally letting his real feelings surge out after years of frustration, hurt, and betrayal. And what he reportedly said to his younger brother wasn't just a warning. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even anger in its traditional form. It was a severing, a verbal severance of royal blood ties. A sentence that would echo through royal halls long after the confrontation ended. Some say it was the moment the monarchy itself cracked. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But here's the question you have to ask yourself. How do two brothers who once shared everything, a childhood, grief, duty, secrets, even the weight of the world, end up standing on opposite sides of an emotional battlefield? How does the spare, the boy who once walked behind his mother's coffin with trembling hands, become the man firing public shots at the institution that raised him? And how does the heir, the future king, the stable one, the steady one, reach a breaking point so sharp it slices straight through any remaining hope of reconciliation? If this feud were a Hollywood movie, you'd think it was exaggerated, too dramatic, too personal, too painful. But reality? Reality has a way of being far messier and far more shocking than fiction. And that's why this story matters. Because we aren't simply watching a royal disagreement. We're witnessing a collapse, a brotherhood turned battleground, a monarchy under unprecedented pressure, a future king forced into emotional corners he never wanted to confront. And yes, a rebellious younger brother who seems determined to burn every single bridge he once walked across. For years, the world has watched Harry speak publicly about family trauma, racism allegations, resentment, emotional wounds, royal protocol, psychological scars. Each interview, each documentary, each memoir chapter felt like throwing another log onto a fire that refuses to die out. But according to palace insiders, the moment William heard Harry's latest public remarks that insiders say were interpreted as personal, targeted, and unforgiving, something inside him snapped. And here's where the escalation begins. Because this wasn't just irritation. This wasn't typical sibling rivalry. This wasn't the quiet disappointment the royals have carefully hidden for years. No, this was a visceral reaction. A line crossed. A line that William reportedly believed Harry knew he shouldn't cross, but crossed anyway. There's a moment, they say, when someone realizes a relationship can't go back to what it once was. And for William, that realization hit like ice. Cold, sharp, merciless. He was done tiptoeing, done trying to understand, done keeping the peace, done protecting Harry from his own words, done shielding the institution from the fallout, done playing the diplomatic older brother. And what he allegedly said next, that short, chilling line, has become the centerpiece of whispers inside royal circles. You're dead for us. For words that erupt like a thunderclap. For words so heavy that they feel like a funeral bell for the relationship the world once romanticized. But let me ask you something. What would push a man like William to that place? The calm one, the composed one, the dutiful one, the peacemaker, the man who's lived his entire life avoiding scandal, minimizing conflict, protecting the institution, and holding his emotions behind a carefully constructed wall? What breaks a man like that? To understand the answer, you have to step back and remember the history. The brotherly bond between William and Harry wasn't just typical, it was mythologized. Two boys standing alone at their mother's funeral, forced to grow up faster than anyone should, pushed into roles they didn't choose, bound by grief, expectation, and emotional pressure that most people can't even begin to imagine. Their bond became almost symbolic, the idea that tragedy had made them inseparable. Even years later, long after adulthood reshaped their lives, people still clung to the comforting image of the unbreakable royal brothers. So when the cracks started showing, when Harry began speaking publicly, when tension spilled beyond palace walls, the world was stunned. But not everyone inside the royal family was surprised. Because beneath the public smiles, the elegant photo calls, the royal tours, the matching black suits at national ceremonies. Something was shifting. Something deep. Something emotional. Something that neither William nor Harry seemed to fully understand until it exploded onto the world stage. And as Harry's public criticisms intensified, from toxic culture to emotional neglect to favoritism to allegations of racism, William found himself under a spotlight he never wanted. A spotlight he never asked for. A spotlight created by his own brother. And that's the irony, isn't it? The person you expect to defend you becomes the one tearing you down. The person you trust becomes the one who exposes you. The person you walk through fire with becomes the one lighting the matches. Now ask yourself another question. How much can one man take before he breaks? William isn't just a brother. He's the heir, the stabilizer, the future symbol of continuity. Every choice he makes carries weight. Every reaction becomes a headline. Every emotion becomes a political calculation. So to hear him reach a point of fury, a point of emotional exhaustion so intense he would lash out at Harry, tells you just how deep the wounds go. Because this wasn't a moment of pettiness. It wasn't a fleeting annoyance. It was the culmination of years of strain, conflict, betrayal, and disappointment. But here's where things get more intense. Because Prince William's outburst didn't happen in isolation. It wasn't just a private moment of emotional overflow. According to sources, it triggered a series of reactions deep within the royal machinery, a machinery that rarely tolerates raw emotion, let alone open hostility between heirs to the throne. And that machinery? It started moving fast. Advisors scrambling, senior officials alarmed, communications teams rushing to put out fires before the press caught wind of anything. The moment William's message reached Harry, the ripple effect spread instantly. Through staff, through households, through back channels, through every level of the royal institution. People were stunned, some heartbroken, some furious, some simply whispered that the feud had finally reached a point of no repair. But if you think William's message was the most shocking part, wait until you hear Harry's reaction. Because here's the twist. Harry didn't just recoil. He didn't step back. He didn't attempt a quiet private response. No, insiders say he doubled down. He reacted not with reconciliation, but with fire, with indignation, with a renewed determination to speak publicly. And that reaction is what turned William's private fury into a full-blown royal crisis. Why? Because suddenly, two brothers weren't simply disagreeing. They weren't even arguing. They weren't debating or negotiating or trying to mend anything. No, they were preparing for war. A war fought in interviews. A war fought in statements. A war fought in silence. A war fought in headlines. A war fought in every corner of the public eye. And you have to wonder, how did the world's most photographed family let things fall this far? How did a monarchy that survived abdications, scandals, divorces, tragedies, and generational shifts fail to keep two brothers united? Or at least civil? This is why we're here. This is why the story hits so hard. Because the William versus Harry feud isn't just royal gossip. It's a global spectacle, an emotional catastrophe, a painful unraveling of a family under impossible pressure. And yet, beneath all the drama, beneath all the royal protocol and palace walls, beneath the titles and the expectations, there's something undeniably human happening here. Hurt, betrayal, disappointment, anger, fear, the feeling of losing someone you once trusted completely. And the real shock? It's not over, not even close. Because if insiders are correct, Prince William's explosive message wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a chain reaction. A chain reaction that will take you through private conversations, secret strategy meetings, emotional confrontations, and explosive revelations from inside the palace. And every piece of this story brings you one step closer to understanding how the royal family reached the brink, and why the consequences may be far more devastating than anyone realizes. But before we dive deeper, before we pull back the layers, before we uncover the truth behind each shocking moment, you need to hold on to one idea. Nothing in this feud happened by accident. Every moment was a build-up. Every word was a spark. Every silence was a message. Every decision was a turning point. And once you see how all of these pieces connect, you'll understand why the message, "You're dead for US," may be the most revealing and terrifying thing William has ever said. Because what came next would change everything. And no one, not even Harry, saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what it actually looks like when a future king reaches his emotional limit? Not in public where cameras are watching, not at a polished photo call, but behind closed doors where raw honesty finally spills out? Because that's exactly where we pick up. The moment after the emotional explosion hinted in the introduction. The moment where William's fury wasn't just an outburst. It was the culmination of years of pressure, betrayal, and heartbreak that had been building like a storm trapped behind palace walls. And here's the real question. What does a man who has spent his entire life being told to stay composed actually do when he breaks? When the royal mask slips? When the weight of the crown bears down so heavily that even the most disciplined heir finally says enough? Let that settle in for a moment. Because it's easy to think of William as the solid one, the stable one, the reliable one. The man who rarely raises his voice. The man who walks with measured steps, speaks with careful restraint, and carries centuries of tradition in his posture. But imagine living that way every single day. Imagine the pressure of knowing that every word you say, every expression on your face, every moment you show emotion is recorded, interpreted, spun, and dissected. Imagine being forced to smile politely while the person who knows your childhood pain better than anyone, your own brother, publicly questions your character, your family, your responsibilities, your institution, and even your intentions. How long can anyone hold that kind of emotional tension without cracking? And this is where our story truly begins. Not with Harry's public interviews, not with the headlines, not with the documentaries, but with the moment William realized the damage wasn't just external anymore. It was personal, deeply personal. Because when you strip away the titles, the crown, the state functions, the centuries-old protocol, what remains is a man who feels, a man who hurts, a man who bleeds. And despite everything, despite the public roles that separate them, William and Harry were once just two brothers who needed each other. So when the person you once trusted most becomes the one attacking you relentlessly, it doesn't just sting, it fractures something core within you. That fracture is where this chapter begins. Inside Kensington Palace, long after the staff had retreated for the night, long after the lights in the public wings dimmed, long after the newspapers had printed the latest round of Harry's explosive commentary, William sat alone with the weight of those words pressing onto him like a physical force. The walls around him, filled with portraits of monarchs and ancestors, seemed to loom tighter. The silence in the room felt loud, and the headline that triggered him, the one Harry had allowed or encouraged to spread, felt like the ultimate betrayal. You've probably seen the headlines yourself. Ones that imply William was cold. Ones that suggest he was unfeeling. Ones that paint him as privileged while portraying Harry as the survivor of deep, unspoken trauma. And while some of these narratives came from Harry directly, others were shaped in the aftermath of his interviews, his memoir, his documentaries, his comments about family dynamics. But this time the language cut differently. It wasn't vague, wasn't implied. It felt pointed. It felt personal. It felt deliberate. And William, who had swallowed so many of these barbs in silence, felt something inside him finally crack. Now pause for a moment. Have you ever been pushed so far by someone you love that your emotions overwhelm your logic? That your instinct isn't diplomacy but defense? That your reaction isn't polished but primal? Because that's what insiders say happened. William didn't rehearse his reaction. He didn't calculate it. He didn't consider how it would be interpreted. For once, he simply reacted like a human being who had been pushed too far. He reportedly picked up his phone, pacing, breathing hard, trying to steady himself, but failing miserably. Staff nearby could hear the tension in every hurried step. Advisors later described this moment as the closest they had ever seen William get to completely losing his composure. And from a man who has weathered scandals, crises, family tragedies, and national upheavals without so much as a visible crack. That says everything. But what was he breaking from exactly? What pressure point had Harry hit this time? To understand that, you have to look at the timeline leading up to this moment. Because Harry's commentary had shifted, not all at once, but slowly, over time. At first it was subtle, almost understandable. Stories about feeling trapped. Stories about wanting freedom. Stories about trying to protect Meghan, stories about being emotionally overwhelmed, stories about the institution failing them. Many people sympathized. Even some inside the palace admitted things hadn't always been handled perfectly. But then came the interviews that dug deeper. The memoir that stripped away private moments. The insinuations that the family had ignored or dismissed serious mental health concerns. The allegations of unconscious bias. The hints that William had been physically aggressive or emotionally cold. The framing of William as the favored son while Harry was the neglected spare. Every revelation chipped away at something fragile. The monarchy could survive. The institution could withstand scrutiny. But the brotherhood? That bond. It was unraveling thread by thread. And then came the latest remark, the one that William read just hours before this breaking point. A remark insiders say he interpreted as a direct attack on his integrity as a future king. Not just a brotherly jab, not just a personal grievance, but a public suggestion that he was unfit in a way that struck at the deepest part of his identity. The heir, the future monarch, the man who had spent decades preparing for a role he never asked for but fully accepted. Imagine dedicating your life to something you can't escape. Imagine shaping every decision you make around a destiny you didn't choose. Imagine carrying that weight, and then having your own brother publicly question your ability to do it. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And each time, the world listened. Headlines multiplied, narratives spread, and William stayed silent, because that is what the role demands. That is what the institution expects. That is what the monarchy requires. Until now. Because when he saw those remarks, when he realized Harry wasn't just speaking his truth, but dismantling William's in the process, that emotional dam finally burst. And William, for the first time in years, allowed himself to feel the full storm. There are conflicting reports about how exactly the breaking point unfolded, but the version that appears most consistent among insiders goes something like this. William tried to call Harry. Not to argue, not to threaten, not to debate. To ask why? To ask how things had gone so wrong. To ask whether this was really the path Harry wanted to walk. But when the call went unanswered, William felt a rush of emotion he hadn't expected. Anger, yes, but also something deeper. Something like grief. Something like mourning a relationship that no longer resembled what it once was. This is the part that surprises people. William wasn't just furious. He was devastated. Because anger is a surface emotion. Grief? That's a wound. And William realized, in that quiet moment alone, that he had been grieving his brother for far longer than he wanted to admit. And that grief turned into the outburst we are building toward. The moment you've been waiting for. The message that shattered whatever remained between them. But before that message was sent, something else happened. Something unexpected. Something telling. Something that reveals just how deeply this feud has cut into William's life. Kate walked into the room. She didn't say a word at first. She just looked at her husband, the man she had known since university, the man she had supported through countless storms, the man who carried everything silently, and saw the weight he had been hiding. She saw the frustration, the exhaustion, the pain, the vulnerability, and her presence in that moment seemed to confirm something William had been trying to deny. He wasn't just dealing with a public relations crisis. He was dealing with heartbreak. And yet, even Kate's quiet support couldn't stop what happened next. William spoke, quietly at first, then louder, then with a conviction that alarmed even his wife. He said things he had never said aloud before. He admitted fears he had buried. He acknowledged how deeply Harry's words had wounded him. And then he made a decision. A decision that insiders say Kate couldn't stop, couldn't alter, and ultimately couldn't soften. He reached for his phone again. His hands shook, not from fear, but from emotion. His chest felt tight. His jaw was clenched. And he typed the message that would be whispered about across royal households for weeks. The message that carried the weight of years of hurt. The message that came from a man who had finally reached his limit. The message that would shape the next chapter of their lives. But here's the twist. The message wasn't sent right away. Because just as William was about to hit send, something happened. Something subtle. Something quiet. Something that changed the emotional tone of the room and added a layer of complexity that no one expected. Someone else walked in. Someone who wasn't supposed to be part of this moment. And what happened next would shift the trajectory of this confrontation in a way no one in that room, not even William, saw coming. Have you ever felt a moment freeze in time? Not because of fear, not because of danger, but because you suddenly know something irreversible is about to happen? That's exactly what settled over the room when that unexpected figure stepped into William's private space. It wasn't an advisor. It wasn't a staff member. And it wasn't one of the children. It was someone whose presence instantly tightened the emotional tension like a rope pulled at both ends. Someone who had heard enough whispers in the last few weeks to sense that something in the royal household was unraveling fast. It was one of William's closest aides, a longtime, fiercely loyal staffer who had served him through crises, tours, state duties, and family upheavals. A person who normally never intruded. A person who only entered rooms when things had reached a critical threshold. And in that moment, the look on the aide's face said everything. The palace already knew things had gone too far. Now pause here for a moment. Think about what that means. Think about what it means for palace staff, trained, loyal, disciplined, to step into the future king's private emotional space uninvited. Staff never interrupt personal moments unless something is on fire, metaphorically or literally. And while nothing was burning physically, the emotional wildfire between the royal brothers was threatening to ignite a crisis far more destructive than any external scandal. The aide didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, breathing carefully, as though choosing the exact words that would neither inflame nor smother the situation. Kate looked at him with quiet understanding. She knew this wasn't a social interruption. This was intervention. And William? He was torn. He didn't want anyone witnessing him at his most vulnerable. But he also didn't want to suppress the fury, the heartbreak, the sense of betrayal flooding every inch of him. And then, after a long, heavy moment, the aide finally said the words that marked the true beginning of this chapter. "Sir, you should know something before you press send." Just imagine hearing that when you already feel emotionally overwhelmed. Imagine being on the precipice of making a decision that could redefine your relationship with your brother forever, only to be told there's even more going on behind the scenes than you realized. William's jaw tightened. Kate's eyebrows knit in concern, and the entire atmosphere in the room seemed to shift, as if the story were about to twist in a way no one had anticipated. The aide stepped further inside and closed the door quietly, a sign that whatever he was about to say was meant for no other ears. William braced himself, bracing his phone in the same moment, torn between listening and sending the message anyway. But when the aide finally spoke, the impact hit William harder than any headline Harry had ever released. "Sir, something has leaked. We don't know by whom." There it was. The trigger, the revelation, the spark that would push William's emotions from boiling to explosive. Let's stop for a second and examine that. Because for the royal family, a leak isn't just inconvenient. It's destabilizing. It's dangerous. It's a crack in the castle wall that the world can peer through. And this wasn't a small leak. This was the kind that rattles the internal structure, the kind that suggests someone on the inside was feeding information to the outside world. And not just any information. Information that could worsen the already tense relationship between the brothers. William knew instantly what this meant. He wasn't naive. He understood how leaks worked. Some were accidental. Some were strategic. Some were planted by allies. Some were planted by enemies. But in this moment, the aide's voice carried an even more dangerous implication. The leak seemed connected to Harry, or at least Harry's circle, which meant someone was playing a dangerous game with the two brothers, stirring the pot, fanning the flames, widening the cracks. William's grip on his phone tightened so sharply that his knuckles turned white. He asked the obvious question. What leaked? The aide hesitated. And that hesitation, that brief, weighted pause, told William everything he needed to know. "It's your voicemail, sir." Not the message he was typing. Not the emotional explosion ready to be sent. But an earlier voicemail. An earlier attempt. An earlier moment of vulnerability William had tried to hide. You need to picture this moment clearly. An earlier voicemail William had left, in good faith, during a time when he had still hoped for reconciliation, had somehow ended up in the hands of someone who was not supposed to have it. Not just anyone, but someone who had apparently shared it. Kate's eyes widened. William's chest tightened. He swallowed hard. But inside his mind, something else clicked into place, and it was a realization that both hurt and enraged him. Harry knew. Harry knew exactly how William sounded when he was trying to reach out, when he was trying to mend things, when he was trying to fix a relationship he never wanted to break. And instead of keeping that attempt private, someone had weaponized it. Harry received it. The aide continued. And, sir, it appears he may have mentioned it to people he shouldn't have. That was the moment William felt something inside him fracture. Because reconciliation attempts weren't supposed to become talking points. They weren't supposed to be shared casually. They weren't supposed to be leaked. They were supposed to remain private, sacred, even. If Harry truly wanted healing, he should have protected those attempts, cherished them, responded to them. But instead, the voicemail had become ammunition. Think about that. Let that sink in. Even if Harry hadn't leaked it directly, someone close enough to him, someone within his orbit, had heard it, which meant William's vulnerability was not a closed door anymore. It was open for interpretation, open for discussion, open for manipulation. And suddenly, all the emotional hurt, all the frustration, all the bitterness that had built inside William surged forward at once. Because what do you do when your last attempt at peace becomes the next instrument of war? Kate tried to steady him with a gentle look, but even she knew the gravity of what was unfolding. This wasn't just another feud. This wasn't just another misunderstanding. This was betrayal. A quiet, devastating betrayal. William turned away, running a hand down his face, pacing across the room as he tried to make sense of it. His breathing was sharp. His emotions were no longer neatly contained. His thoughts raced. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't care about royal composure. He didn't care about image. He didn't care about duty. He cared about the truth. He cared about the hurt. He cared about the fact that the little boy he once protected, the brother he once considered his closest confidant, had allowed something so intimate to slip through the cracks and into the hands of strangers. And that's when William made the decision. The decision that no one, not even Kate, could stop. The decision that would change the tone of the feud forever. He looked at his phone again. He opened the message screen. And with a calmness that was almost more terrifying than anger, he typed the words that would forever define this moment. You're dead for us. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't accidental. It was intentional. It was deliberate. It was the emotional breaking point converted into language. But here's the twist. The actual message he sent wasn't just those 4 words. It was longer, more layered, more emotional, more devastating. And that full message? The one insiders whispered about for weeks? The one staff members described as the most intense communication between the brothers in years? That message didn't stay private for long. Because the moment William hit send, something happened in Harry's camp that no one in Kensington Palace had anticipated. Someone else read it first, and their reaction would ignite the next phase of this royal firestorm. Have you ever watched someone receive a message that changes the entire energy in a room? A message that freezes the air, tightens every muscle, and flips a quiet space into a storm zone? That's exactly what happened the moment William's explosive text, the one that was never meant to leave the walls of Kensington Palace, reached Harry's side. But the real shock wasn't Harry's reaction. It was the reaction of the person who saw it first. Because when that message illuminated the screen, when those cutting words appeared, when the weight of William's decision finally crossed the Atlantic, the first person to read it wasn't Harry. It was Meghan, and her reaction didn't stay quiet. But before we dive into the emotional shockwave on Harry's end, you need to understand something crucial, something that sets the stage for this chapter. Because when William pressed send, when those words traveled like a spark into an already volatile environment, they didn't just ignite tension in California. They sent a shockwave right back across the ocean, crashing straight into the royal household, straight to King Charles, straight to Queen Camilla. And the reactions inside Buckingham Palace were unlike anything anyone expected. Now ask yourself, how does a monarch respond when one son detonates the emotional equivalent of a nuclear bomb on the other? How does a king handle a family crisis that threatens not just personal relationships, but the entire public image of the institution he leads? Does he step in? Does he defend? Does he mediate? Or does he remain silent, hoping the storm will burn itself out? The answer, according to insiders, is more complicated than you might imagine. The moment Charles heard whispers about a serious escalation, he didn't panic. He didn't lash out. He didn't react the way a father would. He reacted the way a king has been trained to react, with silence. Measured, deliberate, strategic silence. The kind of silence that is meant to keep the crown steady, even when everything beneath it is shaking. But not everyone in the palace approved of that silence. Because while Charles was trying to stay neutral, trying to avoid worsening the crisis, trying to keep emotions separate from duty, Camilla was having none of it. And this is where things get explosive. Imagine the atmosphere. Charles in his private study, papers neatly stacked beside him, glasses perched carefully on his nose, listening as an aide explains the situation. William's message. The leak. The growing conflict. The possibility, no, the inevitability. That the feud was about to become public in a way no one could control. Charles, breathing slowly, processing every word. And then Camilla walked in. She didn't knock. She didn't wait to be invited. She stepped through the door with the kind of practiced authority that told everyone in her path she wasn't there to spectate. She was there to intervene. Is it true? She demanded, looking straight at Charles. He hesitated, which was all the answer she needed. Camilla's reaction wasn't just anger. It was fury layered with disbelief, irritation, and a sharp protectiveness over the institution she had fought for decades to be accepted into. And while some may find that surprising, insiders insist that Camilla has always been deeply sensitive to anything that threatens the stability of the monarchy. And to her, Harry's actions weren't just attacks on the family, they were attacks on the crown itself. You cannot let this continue, she reportedly snapped, pacing the room. Charles responded the same way he has responded to countless crises over the decades, with calm, cautious neutrality. The kind of composed demeanor that frustrates passionate people because it refuses to meet their energy. But Camilla wasn't looking for calm. She was looking for action, because she understood something Charles didn't, or refused, to accept. The feud was no longer just between brothers. It was now threatening the entire monarchy. Her voice grew sharper as she continued. Harry is undermining the family. William is at breaking point. And if you don't step in, this won't end with an argument. It will end with public catastrophe. Think about that. Think about the implications. Think about the internal panic rising behind the palace walls. Because when Camilla speaks like that, royal aides listen. They take notes. They prepare contingencies. They brace for the ripple effect. But Charles didn't budge. Instead, he did what kings do. He waited. He measured. He hoped the situation would de-escalate if he simply refrained from feeding the fire. The problem? William's message was already a roaring blaze, and silence wasn't going to smother it. It was going to fuel it. Camilla, realizing Charles wasn't going to take immediate action, made a decision of her own. One that shocked staff. One that shifted the dynamic. One that, according to inside sources, might have permanently altered her relationship with Harry and Meghan. She ordered a private briefing. A briefing specifically focused on Harry's most recent public comments. A briefing on how those comments were affecting William emotionally. A briefing on how the public was interpreting Harry's narrative. And, most importantly, a briefing on how to protect the monarchy from further reputational damage. Now picture this. Aides gathering documents, printing headlines, reviewing social media sentiment, collecting transcripts, compiling timelines. All while Charles remained in his study, quietly watching the storm gather energy. And here's where things take a shocking turn. During that briefing, Camilla reportedly said something that chilled the room. If he wants to destroy the institution, we won't let him. She didn't say Harry's name. She didn't need to. Everyone knew who she meant. And that's the emotional contradiction that makes this chapter so powerful. Because while Charles responded with silence, hoping neutrality would restore peace, Camilla reacted with fire. Not because she hated Harry, but because she believed, truly believed, that letting Harry continue unchecked was dangerous. And in her mind, William's explosion wasn't the problem. It was the warning sign, the alarm bell, the proof that something had gone too far. Now let's shift back to the text. The message William sent, the one that Meghan read first, the one that traveled faster than anyone in the palace expected. Because as Camilla was rallying aides, and as Charles was retreating into measured silence, the repercussions of that message were already unfolding across the ocean. In Montecito, in the Sussex household, where Meghan's reaction to William's message didn't just spark outrage. It triggered a chain reaction that would eventually circle right back through the palace and land on Camilla's desk with a thud. But before we get there, you need to understand the emotional core of this chapter, the conflicting philosophies inside Buckingham Palace that shaped what came next. Charles believed silence would prevent escalation. Camilla believed silence would cause collapse. Charles believed the brothers needed space. Camilla believed the brothers needed boundaries. Charles wanted to wait for facts. Camilla wanted to react to the undeniable. Charles saw the feud as personal. Camilla saw the feud as existential. This internal conflict, the king's silence versus the queen's fury, created a tension inside Buckingham Palace that reverberated through every hallway, every briefing room, every private office. Staff felt it. Advisors whispered about it. And at the center of it all was William, who was being torn between duty and emotion, between composure and heartbreak, between the role he was born into and the man he truly was. But here's where everything collides. Because while Charles was saying nothing and Camilla was preparing for war, someone in the palace did something neither of them expected. Someone reached out to Harry, not to reconcile, not to mediate, not to soothe tensions, but to warn him that William's message, the message Meghan had already read, was spreading through the palace like wildfire. To warn him that Camilla was furious. To warn him that this feud had now moved beyond private conflict. And when Harry learned what was happening behind palace walls, when he learned about Charles's silence and Camilla's rage, his response was not calm. It was not measured. It was not rational. It was emotional, deeply emotional. The kind of emotion that would lead him into his next move. A move so explosive, so ill-timed, so shocking, that it would leave William furious and the palace scrambling. But what did Harry do? What did he say? How did he respond to the message his brother sent, and the reactions reverberating through Buckingham Palace? What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever noticed how the biggest decisions in powerful families never happen in public? They happen in quiet rooms, behind heavy doors, under the soft hum of tension that only insiders can feel? Because that is exactly where we're going now. Into one of the most carefully guarded royal spaces. Into a meeting that was never supposed to be discussed. Into the room where Prince William stopped reacting emotionally and started plotting strategically. And if you thought the feud had already reached its peak, what happened at Windsor proved the worst was yet to come. And here's the hook you need to hold on to. William didn't call this meeting because he wanted advice. He called it because he wanted control. Think back to the previous chapter. William had already sent the explosive message. Charles was silent. Camilla was furious. Harry was reeling. Meghan was influencing. The monarchy was trembling. And the public, they still knew nothing. Not yet. But William understood something the others didn't. Silence alone was not going to save the institution this time. Not with Harry threatening to speak again. Not with the leak of that voicemail. Not with the escalating narrative painting him as the cold, heartless future king. So William did what future kings do when their legacy is under threat. He summoned his inner circle. And where did he choose to do it? Not Kensington Palace, where staff chatter runs like underground electricity. Not Buckingham Palace, where every corridor has ears. Not Clarence House, which sits too close to Charles's influence. He chose Windsor, a place thick with history, a place where monarchs have survived wars, scandals, abdications, and whispers of revolution. A place where the walls are older than the very idea of modern Britain. A place private enough for secrets, safe enough for strategy, isolated enough for brutal honesty. The meeting was scheduled late in the evening. A deliberate choice. Fewer staff, fewer prying eyes, fewer risks. And William arrived early, pacing through the long hallway leading to a historic chamber where advisors had met during crises stretching back centuries. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old leather. Heavy curtains blocked any view from outside. The large oak table in the center looked more like a battlefield than a discussion space, and that was fitting. Because tonight was war planning. William's closest advisor, someone who had counseled him for more than a decade, was the first to enter. The advisor said nothing at first, simply studying William's expression, the clenched jaw, the stiff shoulders, the eyes that looked like they had been holding back years of exhaustion. He knew this wasn't a routine meeting. This was something deeper. Slowly, more senior officials arrived. Communications experts, political strategists, institutional guardians whose job was to protect the monarchy from collapsing under pressure, people who normally only assembled for national emergencies, terrorist threats, constitutional crises, international incidents. Tonight the incident was internal, personal, familial, explosive. Harry. When everyone had finally gathered, William took his seat at the head of the table. Not because he was the heir, not because protocol demanded it, but because this was his crisis, his burden, his line to defend. The room was silent, almost reverent. And then William spoke with a voice that was lower than usual, rougher, charged with a weight that no one had ever heard from him before. This cannot go on. Just 6 words, but they carried the emotional mass of years. Advisors straightened. Pen stopped. Heartbeats almost became audible. Because when the future king says those words, you know what follows is serious. William continued, quieter but colder. He's not just hurting me. He's hurting the institution. And there it was. The separation. The line drawn. Not William versus Harry anymore, but the monarchy versus Harry. And that shift was the moment everyone in the room realized. This wasn't just a family feud. This was a constitutional hazard. The lead communications strategist spoke first, cautiously. Sir, what exactly are you hoping to achieve? William's reply was immediate. Clarity. Boundaries. Strategy. 3 words. Simple. Ruthless. Absolute. He was done with emotional chaos. Done with waiting for Harry's next move. Done with being the target of unpredictable explosive interviews. Done with being cast as the villain in Harry's personal narrative. One advisor, older, seasoned, with decades of palace experience, leaned forward and said something that changed the tone of everything. Sir, all due respect, but we need to ask the question no one wants to ask. William's eyes tightened slightly. Go on. The advisor hesitated, then said it. What if Harry's no longer salvageable? The room went silent, painfully silent. Even the hum of the old overhead lights felt louder in the sudden stillness. William didn't speak. Kate wasn't present to soften the blow. Charles wasn't there to object. Camilla wasn't there to push her agenda. It was just William, and the truth none of them wanted to articulate. Another advisor chimed in, more gently. We're not saying give up on him emotionally, sir. But institutionally, he is unpredictable, uncontrolled, and he seems determined to shape a narrative that undermines your future reign. William's fingers drummed once against the table, a small gesture that revealed the emotional conflict boiling inside him. What do you do when your own brother becomes your greatest threat? How do you separate love from responsibility? How do you defend the future when the past is attacking you? William finally exhaled and said quietly, Continue. The meeting opened up into a storm of perspectives. Some advisors argued for a distancing strategy, creating a clear, public line between William's household and Harry's. Others argued for private negotiations. Some suggested issuing subtle corrections through friendly media. Others pushed for silence, strategic, carefully maintained silence that would make Harry's voice echo into emptiness. But one advisor, a sharp, politically savvy figure, introduced the idea that shocked everyone. We may need to consider institutional separation. William stared. Meaning, the advisor said carefully, that the monarchy may need to formally recognize Harry's decision to separate from his royal role permanently. This wasn't new in concept, but in tone, it was seismic, because the conversation wasn't about reconciliation anymore. It was about containment. And this is where the meeting took a darker, more complex turn. Another advisor added, we have to think long-term. 20 years from now, you will be king. Your children will be working royals. And Harry's choices today will influence how the public views the next generation. If he continues on this path, it could damage the crown's credibility. The word credibility hit William like a punch, because that was the one thing he had always protected with sacred intensity. But the contradictions in the room were growing. One advisor argued sensitivity. Another argued firmness. One advisor urged caution. Another urged decisive action. William listened to every argument, his face unreadable. He wasn't trying to be cold. He was trying to be deliberate, because he knew that once he made a decision, there would be no going back. And then, as discussions grew heated, something unexpected happened. A junior advisor, usually quiet, spoke up nervously. "Sir, may I ask a personal question?" William nodded. "Have you given up on him?" The room went still again. William's jaw tightened. His eyes softened, but only for a second. "No," he said firmly. "I haven't. But I cannot let him destroy this institution. I won't let the monarchy fall apart because of one man's anger." The contradiction in that answer, love and duty colliding, shook the room more than any argument so far. And then came the final moment of the meeting, the moment no advisor expected, the moment that revealed just how deeply William had changed. He stood. He placed both hands on the table. And he said, "We prepare for escalation. Quietly, strategically, efficiently. If he attacks again, we will not stay silent." The advisors exchanged glances. This was a new William, a harder William, a William shaped by pain, betrayal, and responsibility. But before the meeting ended, one advisor raised a question that froze everyone in their seats. "Sir, if Harry escalates again, what exactly do we do?" William's eyes narrowed, and his answer was chilling. "We respond." "But respond how, sir?" And here's the moment that sets up everything to come. William didn't answer. He didn't speak. He simply looked toward the window, toward the darkness beyond Windsor's stone walls, as if imagining the future he was being forced to build. And when he finally turned back to the room, he said, "You'll know when the time comes." But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that even as this strategy meeting ended, something was already happening on Harry's side. Something unexpected, something emotional, something that would blow apart everything William had planned. And no one saw it coming. Have you ever felt the air thicken in a room? Not because of temperature, but because of the sheer weight of a truth no one wants to say out loud? That's exactly what settled over William's inner circle in the aftermath of the Windsor strategy meeting. Advisors filed out with guarded expressions, each one aware that they had stepped across a line no royal team had crossed in generations. And at the center of it all stood Prince William, shoulders squared but eyes shadowed, processing the meeting's final implication. What if the monarchy, the institution he had been trained to protect since childhood, could no longer include his own brother? Let's pause on that for a moment, because it's easy to see the royal feud as gossip, headlines, entertainment. But peel back the layers, and what you have is something much darker, a man being forced to choose between his blood and his destiny. And in that emotional collision, that brutal crossroads, lies the question that formed the spine of this chapter. The question that no one wanted to ask. The question that no one dared to speak during the meeting. The question that everyone was thinking. What if Harry had already crossed a line that made reconciliation impossible? That question lingered in the hallways long after advisors left. It lingered in William's mind as he walked down a dim corridor lined with portraits of past monarchs, all staring down at him as if silently judging his every move. It lingered in the heavy echo of his footsteps. It lingered in the quiet tremor of his hands as he removed his tie, loosening the fabric that suddenly felt suffocating around his neck. And it lingered most of all in the gnawing realization that the brother he once protected at all costs might now be the one he needed protection from. But while Windsor Castle was steeping in tense silence, hundreds of miles away in Montecito, another emotional storm was breaking open, one that would feed directly into the question hanging over the monarchy. Because as William was contemplating institutional strategy, Harry was confronting something else entirely. The feeling that he had finally been severed from the family he thought he could still reach. Let's go there now. Let's step inside Harry's world. Picture the scene, a quiet evening in California. Warm lighting, soft modern decor, the distant ocean breeze rustling through the trees outside. A setting that should feel peaceful, but wasn't. Because in the middle of this calm space sat Megan, staring at William's text message, her expression morphing from shock to anger, to something that looked a lot like vindication. "You're dead for us." For words that hit her like a slap. For words that she immediately interpreted as hostility, not just toward Harry, but toward them both. For words that seemed to validate every fear, every resentment, every wound she had carried since stepping into the royal world. Harry walked into the room just as Megan lifted her gaze from the screen. Her expression was tight, her voice low. "You need to see this." Harry's reaction was instant, the kind of jolt that comes from trauma, from memory, from emotional scars. His eyes scanned the message quickly, But the impact hit slowly, seeping into him like poison. He swallowed hard, tension rising in his jaw, his throat, his posture. He whispered, "He said that to me?" Megan didn't hesitate. "To us." And that shift, that framing, changed everything. Because Harry wasn't just reading a message anymore. He was absorbing a narrative. A narrative in which he wasn't the rebellious younger brother who had pushed too far. He was the victim, the outcast, the one being punished for speaking his truth. But the truth is complicated, isn't it? Because while Harry saw the message as an attack, William had sent it as a breaking point. A desperate, painful, human moment. A reaction to grief. A reaction to betrayal. A reaction to years of feeling painted as the villain in Harry's story. And in that emotional contradiction, the place where both brothers felt justified and wounded, lies the entire tragedy of this war. Harry sank onto the sofa, elbows on his knees, head hanging low. The message burned behind his eyes. He could practically hear William's voice saying it, stern, disappointed, final. And for a moment, just a brief, flickering moment, Harry looked less angry and more heartbroken. "Why would he say that?" he murmured. "Why would my own brother?" Megan cut in sharply. "Because this is who they are, Harry. You've seen it. You've lived it. They shut you out the moment you stopped obeying." Harry shook his head, torn between disbelief and dawning clarity. "But I thought there was still a chance." And this, right here, is the emotional paradox that fueled everything that came next. Harry thought he still had a door open. William thought Harry had already burned it down. Harry thought he was exposing the truth to heal. William thought Harry was attacking the family to hurt. Harry thought speaking out would force change. William thought speaking out was betrayal. Two brothers. Two truths. Two wounds that only deepened each other. But as Harry sat there processing the message, something else occurred to him. Something that made his stomach drop. "Who else has seen this?" he whispered. Megan hesitated. "His staff. His advisors. Probably more by now." Harry clenched his jaw. "So they're passing it around. Laughing. Judging. Using it to paint me as the problem." And there it was, the thought that triggered his next emotional shift. The shift that turned pain into defensiveness. Defensiveness into anger. Anger into something sharper, something more driven. "He wants a war," Harry said quietly. "He wants to push me away. He wants me to react." Then he stood. "But I won't stay silent." And this exact moment, forms the hinge of the entire story. Because while William was planning strategy, building boundaries, trying to contain the damage, Harry was gearing up to escalate. Not privately, not gently, not with diplomacy, publicly. And here's where the narrative circles back to Windsor. Because at the same time Harry was preparing to speak, the advisors who had met with William were still discussing the question that had hung over the table like a curse. The question no one wanted to ask. "Sir, if Harry goes public again," one advisor had said earlier, voice trembling with the weight of history, "what do you want us to do?" William's answer had been vague. Chill. Ominous. "You'll know when the time comes." But that wasn't entirely true. Because William didn't know. Not really. Not emotionally. Not strategically. Not ethically. How could he? How could anyone prepare for a moment when they might have to defend their legacy against their own brother? The senior advisor who had posed the original unspoken question, the one about Harry being unsalvageable, lingered in the hallway after leaving the meeting. He watched William disappearing into another corridor and whispered to a colleague, "This is the question that will define his reign." Because it wasn't just a question about Harry. It was a question about loyalty, about duty, about responsibility, about the future of the monarchy. And behind that question lay all the questions William had never dared voice. What if helping Harry destroys the institution? What if defending the institution destroys their relationship? What if the only way to protect the crown is to cut off the spare? But this is where it gets even more intense, even more fragile, even more emotionally dangerous. Because just as William was wrestling with those thoughts, alone in Windsor, someone else in the palace made a decision. A young staff member, low-ranking, overlooked, invisible in the grand machinery of royalty. They picked up a phone, and they called someone they should never have contacted. Someone outside the palace, someone close to Harry, to tell them what the palace was planning, to tell them what was discussed behind those walls, to tell them what question had been asked. And that leak, that one small leak, landed in Harry's hands at the exact moment he was preparing to speak publicly again. Which meant that when Harry went to the mic, he wasn't speaking blindly. He was speaking with new knowledge. He was speaking with fire. He was speaking with the belief that William and the monarchy were planning to cut him off completely. And what Harry said next would detonate everything. Have you ever watched two people walk toward a collision you know is going to be catastrophic, but neither of them slows down, neither of them turns away, neither of them sees the point where there's no return? That's exactly where we are now. Because in this chapter, the feud between William and Harry stops being a slow burn and becomes a wildfire. And the spark that ignited it? A leak. A tiny leak. A whisper from inside the palace that traveled thousands of miles and landed in Harry's hands at the exact wrong moment. And here's the shocking part. This leak didn't just expose information. It weaponized it. It transformed suspicion into certainty. And it pushed Harry into a mindset that would shape every explosive decision he made next. Let's go back into that Montecito home. Harry pacing the room, tension rolling off him in waves, Meghan watching with a mixture of vindication and worry. The message from William still lingered on the screen like an open wound. But before Harry could even decide what to do with that emotional blow, his phone buzzed again. A call from an unfamiliar number. Normally, he would have ignored it. Kensington, Buckingham, Clarence House. They didn't call him anymore. Not directly, not kindly, not without strings attached. But something in the air, something in the timing, something in his gut told him to answer. Hello? He said, voice low and guarded. The voice on the other end sounded hesitant. Young. Nervous. Sorry to call, sir. You don't know me. Harry stiffened. Who is this? I can't say. But I'm calling because you need to know something. Meghan stepped closer. Harry put the call on speaker. And then the breathless voice delivered the sentence that would ignite a new level of fury inside Harry. They met at Windsor tonight. A meeting about you. A serious one. Harry's eyes snapped up. Meghan's lips parted in a silent inhale. What meeting? Harry demanded. A shaky swallow. A strategy meeting. Senior advisors. They're discussing containment. Long-term separation. Your role going forward. Containment. Long-term separation. Your role going forward. Those weren't family words. Those were institutional words. Cold. Clinical. Surgical. Words that suggested Harry wasn't simply the estranged son or the frustrated younger brother. He was a problem to be managed. A threat to be contained. Harry felt something inside his chest twist so sharply it hurt. Why are you telling me this? The voice trembled. Because no one else will. And because you deserve to know what's coming. Meghan whispered. Ask them what was said about William. Harry swallowed and did just that. What else? What did they say? A long pause. A painful one. Then, they asked whether you're salvageable. Meghan's jaw clenched. Harry's face drained of color. Salvageable. Not lovable. Not reachable. Not forgivable. Not understandable. A problem. A damaged asset. A human being reduced to a question. Do we fix him or cut him loose? Harry didn't breathe for several seconds. The voice continued, increasingly panicked. And William, he's preparing for escalation. Sir, I'm sorry, but you need to be careful. Be careful. Be careful. The warning kept echoing as the call suddenly cut off, either dropped or deliberately ended. Harry stood frozen, staring at the phone like it had delivered a death sentence. Because in a way it had. This wasn't just a leak. It was confirmation of Harry's worst fear. That the family he once fought for, the family he once sheltered, defended, trusted, was now planning for a future without him. Meghan's voice rose with urgency. Harry, do you see now? They're not confused. They're not hurt. They're not emotional. They're organized. Strategizing. Meeting behind your back. Treating you like an enemy. Harry ran his hands through his hair, shaking his head. I knew things were bad, but this? Containment? Salvageable. But here's the contradiction, the tragic irony, in this moment. While Harry was being told the palace wanted to separate from him, William, hours earlier, had said the opposite. I haven't given up on him. But nuance doesn't survive leaks. Context doesn't survive whispers. Truth doesn't survive fear. What survived was the version of events that confirmed Harry's emotional wounds. And once a wounded man believes those wounds are intentional, the gloves come off. Harry's voice dropped into a sharp, guttural whisper. So that's it. They're done with me. Meghan answered instantly, with fire. Then you speak first. And that single sentence detonated the next phase of the royal war. Because what Harry did next wasn't planned. It wasn't diplomatic. It wasn't careful. It was emotional. Instinctive. Explosive. He opened his laptop. Not to write a letter. Not to draft a private message. Not to communicate with family. To schedule an interview. A major one. With a host known for pulling emotional confessions out of high-profile guests. Someone sympathetic. Someone with reach. Someone who would give Harry the space to speak, and speak loudly. Meghan watched him type with a fierce, almost protective intensity. You need to tell the truth, she said. Your truth. Before they destroy you. Harry nodded, breathing hard. They want to cut me off? Fine. Let them. But they're not going to silence me. Now return with me to Windsor. Earlier that evening. Picture the advisors leaving the castle, walking into the crisp night air, unaware that one of their own was leaking every last detail. Picture William alone in his private suite, unaware that the leak was already spreading across Montecito like wildfire. Picture the tension growing inside Buckingham Palace as staff whispered about the Windsor meeting, without knowing how far it would travel. Because here's the deeper, darker truth. This wasn't just a leak. It was sabotage. Intentional or accidental, it didn't matter. It took the one remaining thread between William and Harry, the fragile belief that reconciliation was possible, and snapped it cleanly in half. Harry, now operating purely on emotion, began drafting bullet points. Not accusations. Not petty grievances. Deep, long-held fears. Things he had never said publicly because they were too raw, too complicated, too personal. Meghan's voice guided him. Tell them how you felt isolated. Tell them how William treated you. Tell them about the meeting. About being called unsalvageable. Tell them the truth before they twist it. Harry's fingers hovered over the keyboard. But something unexpected happened. He hesitated. Even hurt, even angry, even convinced he was being targeted, Harry hesitated. Because part of him still loved William. Still remembered the boy he played with, laughed with, cried with. Still remembered the brother who placed a hand on his back at their mother's funeral. Still remembered the man he once would have trusted with his life. But pain has a way of overriding memory. And the leak that should never have reached him, pushed him past hesitation. He pressed send. The interview was confirmed. Publicists were notified. A date was set. A teaser was scheduled. And within 24 hours, the royal family would wake up to headlines announcing Prince Harry to reveal new, explosive details in upcoming interview. But that wasn't the worst part. Because back in London, before the press even got wind of it, another message reached William. A message that froze him mid-breath. A message he didn't expect. A message that changed everything. Someone forwarded him the leak. The leak about the leak. The leak revealing that Harry knew about the Windsor meeting. That Harry knew about the strategy. About the discussions. About the question no one wanted to ask. And that Harry had already scheduled an interview. William stared at the message, pulse hammering in his ears. Someone had betrayed the palace. Someone had warned Harry. Someone inside his own circle. And with that realization came the chilling truth. This wasn't just a feud. It was a war. And the palace had a spy. But what William said next, after reading the leak, would set the next chapter in motion and shape the entire direction of the royal conflict. Because William didn't whisper. He didn't tremble. He said it clearly, loudly, furiously. Find out who did this. And the manhunt began. But the consequences of what William did next? No one, absolutely no one, saw them coming.